Unaware of Belcher's intentions, the crews of the 4 ships conserved their provisions and deemed it feasible to extract the ships during the summer, since the men were in excellent health. But Belcher, unwavering in his prophetic intuition, remained unyielding to their pleas. As a result, in early May, the crews bid farewell to the ships, regretful of the necessary action. Abiding by Belcher's orders, they rendezvoused at Beechy Island on the North Star, where they were ultimately discovered by the transport ships Phoenix and Talbot. The abandonment of the 5 vessels stirred up unpleasant sentiments in the country. Apart from the significant financial loss, the government was disheartened from pursuing Franklin's expedition further. In mid-October, a court-martial was convened to investigate the matter thoroughly. McClure and Kellett were tried first for abandoning the Investigator and the Resolute, but they were acquitted since they acted under their superiors' orders. Admiral Gordon, the court's president, returned their swords with heartfelt compliments. Sir Edward Belcher was also acquitted, albeit with an implicit reprimand. His sword was returned silently. Most of the ships were lost forever, but the Resolute drifted 1,000 miles through Barrow Strait, Lancaster Sound, and Baffin Bay. Eventually, Captain J.M. Buddington, an American whaler, found her off Cape Dyer. Buddington brought the ship safely to the United States port of New London, where the American government purchased her for $40,000. The Resolute was refitted, and her stores, flags, officers' libraries, and other appointments were restored to their original positions. She was presented to the Queen and the people of Great Britain as a gesture of goodwill from the American nation. Chapter 17. Ray's Journeys. Ray and Sir John Richardson had proven themselves capable in the past, so the government asked for Ray's services in leading the next expedition. Sir George Simpson lent him out and commissioned him to continue the Franklin search in 1851, with the only condition being that the voyage be made by boat. Ray faced difficulty in getting 2 small boats built at the Great Bear Lake, but eventually set off on June 15, 1851, from Provision Station Kendall River. He covered 1,100 miles in 31 days during a preliminary sled expedition to Wollaston Land. After passing through Dease Strait and reaching Cape Colburn, he examined the east coast of Victoria Land, which had never been visited before. However, a northerly gale and packed ice forced him to abandon his boats and continue on foot. The limestone debris made traveling difficult, so he was forced to turn back at a point that was higher than the Erebus, and Terror were abandoned. On his way home he found relics of the Franklin expedition, a boat stanchion, and the butt end of a small flagstaff with a piece of rope attached to it. He returned to Fort Confidence without incident, after exploring 725 miles of unknown coastline in Wollaston and Victoria Lands. For this service, the Royal Geographical Society awarded him the Founder's Gold Medal. His next endeavor was not as a government agent, but as a Hudson's Bay Company servant. His mission was to explore the west coast of Boothia, which was largely uncharted. First, he returned to his former base at Repulse Bay in August. The outlook was bleak, with unfavorable weather for hunting and fishing. No Eskimos were present, indicating that game was scarce. Ray doubted they could survive the winter without more provisions, so he consulted his team. They all decided to stay despite the danger. Fortunately, the weather improved, and they gathered enough resources for the winter. On March 31st, Ray and 4 men embarked on a journey across Boothia Peninsula from Pelly Bay to Castor and Pollux River. They hoped to travel northward along the western coast of Boothia to Bellot Strait and connect Simpson's and Kennedy's discoveries. After 3 weeks, they encountered an Eskimo who revealed the fate of Franklin. Ray recounted the story in his own words. The man spoke openly when asked if he had ever encountered white men or ships, but he replied in the negative. He did, however, mention that a group of Kabloonans had perished from hunger. They were located a considerable distance west of our present location, beyond a vast river. The man did not know the exact location and could not join us on our journey. Further details revealed that 4 years prior, in the spring of 1850, while some Eskimo families hunted seals near the north shore of King William Land, 40 white men were seen traveling together in a southerly direction across the ice. They were dragging a boat and sleds with them and passing along the island's shore. None of the party could speak the Eskimo language well enough to be understood, but by using signs, the natives were led to believe that the ship or ships had been crushed by ice. They were now searching for deer to hunt, as they were running low on provisions. The men appeared thin, with the exception of one officer who was tall, stout, and middle-aged. They purchased some seal meat from the natives and stopped to rest in tents when their daily journey ended. Later that same season, before the ice broke up, the corpses of 30 individuals and some graves were discovered on the continent. On an island nearby, 5 dead bodies were found about a day's journey northwest of the mouth of a large stream, which can only be Back's Great Fish River. The description of the area and its low shore near Point Ogle and Montreal Island matched that of Sir George Back's account. Some of the bodies were in tents, others were under the boat, which had been turned over to form a shelter, and some lay scattered about in different directions. Of those seen on the island, it was supposed that one was that of an officer, as he had a telescope strapped over his shoulders and his double-barreled gun lay underneath him. From the multitude state of many of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that they had been driven to the last, dreaded alternative, cannibalism, as a means of sustaining life. A few of the unfortunate men must have survived until the arrival of the migrating birds, perhaps until the end of May, as fresh bones and feathers of geese were noticed near the scene of the sad event. There appears to have been an abundant store of ammunition, as the gunpowder was emptied by the natives in a heap on the ground, and a quantity of shot and ball was found below the high water mark, having probably been left on the ice close to the beach before the spring thaw commenced. There must have been a number of telescopes, guns, some of them double-barreled, watches, compasses, etc., all of which seem to have been broken up, as I saw pieces of these different articles with the natives, and I purchased as many as possible, together with some silver spoons and forks, an order of merit in the form of a star, and a small platitude engraved Sir John Franklin, K.C.B. These spoons and forks, it may be mentioned, bore the crests and initials of some 15 members of the expedition. So far as Ray could discover, the natives had seen no traces whatever of the ships, and whenever they were questioned about them, they always reverted to the Victory, which was abandoned by Ross in the Gulf of Boothia in 1832. My chief reason, he writes, for believing that none of the ships had been found was the fact that in 1854 the Eskimos were so destitute of wood that, although they had plenty of sealskins to make their small hunting canoes, they had no wood for the frames. Now, as 1846 was 14 years after Ross's vessel was abandoned, and as 1854 was only 4 years by Eskimo account, actually 6 years, after the Franklin ships were abandoned, the probability is that had these ships, or even one of them, been found, the natives would have had at least as much wood in 1854 as they had in 1847. The Fox expedition of 1854 backs the notion that the starved white men did not have large wooden sleds, nor did they have wood larger than what a boat's keel would provide. I asked the Repulse Bay Eskimos numerous times if they found any of the ships, but they knew nothing and kept talking about the Victory, the only vessel where they got wood. I believe the Eskimos were referring to the same ship when talking to McClintock in 1859, and concealed the wreck's location so he wouldn't go there. The white men gestured and spoke a few Eskimo words to tell the Eskimos they would hunt deer on the mainland. The Eskimos found it odd that the sleds were seen during travel, but not with the dead, even though the boat or boats remained. I explained that the white men needed the boat to travel up the Great Fish River, and might have burned the sleds for fuel. The Eskimos agreed, saying they saw fires and goose feathers, indicating the party survived until June. What surprised me then and now was Franklin's party's mistake in retreating to Hudson's Bay territories to save themselves. They should have known from Franklin, Richardson, and Back's painful experience on a brief journey through these barren areas that it was a foolish attempt. The well-known route to Fury Beach, where the Rosses escaped in 1832 or 1833, was far more accessible than any Hudson Bay Company settlement. The ships were not far from Fury Beach, which was slightly farther than Ross's abandoned vessel to the same place. Franklin and his officers knew there was still a large supply of provisions at the site where the Fury had been wrecked in 1859, including preserved vegetables, soups, tobacco, sugar, flour, and more. This supply was much larger than what could be found at many Hudson's Bay trading posts. Additionally, those who retreated to Fury Beach would be in the direct path of searching parties or whalers. The distance from the abandoned ships to Fury Beach is roughly the same as the distance between the ships and the true mouth of the Great Fish River, about 210 geographical miles in a straight line. They could have avoided hauling heavy boats if they had decided to retreat to Fury Beach. During the previous season, a small sled party could have been sent to check on the provisions and boats at the depot. This journey should not have been difficult for an expedition of 130 healthy men, as reported in the record found by McClintock in 1859. Ray's discoveries were just side issues, unrelated to his main objective of exploring Boothia's western coast. Despite the temptation to delve further into Franklin's fate, Ray continued his work. Unfortunately, he lacked sleds and Eskimo assistance, and those who brought him news soon departed. This handicap made a difficult journey even more arduous, but Ray persevered and reached Simpson's farthest point. As instructed, he headed north to Bellot Strait, connecting Simpson and Kennedy's discoveries. However, fog and snow halted his progress at Point de la Guiche, and attempting to reach the strait would endanger his party. On May 7th, Ray turned back and reached Repulse Bay on May 26th. His journey was a great success, adding many miles of coastline to the chart and providing the first authoritative news of Franklin's fate. The government awarded him the offered £10,000. Chapter 18. The Fox, under the command of Commander McClintock. The news Ray brought home caused a stir in England. Authorities felt the need to search for any of the explorers who might have made it to Hudson's Bay Company territories. However, the Crimean War was taking up all the nation's resources. The government asked the company to send out another expedition to search the area around the Great Fish River. Mr. James Anderson was chosen, but he failed to find any valuable clues. The government then decided not to take any further steps, believing that the explorers could not possibly be alive after 11 years. Lady Franklin, however, was determined to find out what happened. With the help of friends, she fitted out the Fox, a steam yacht, and placed it under Commander McClintock's command. Lieutenant West R. Hobson joined as second in command, and Captain Allen Young was the sailing master. Many other members of the company had seen Arctic service as well. Fully provisioned for 28 months, the Fox set sail from Aberdeen on July 1, 1857. McClintock found the ice in Melville Bay in poor condition, but he was determined to push forward. After 3 weeks of struggling, it became clear that he could not cross the bay that year. The Fox was frozen in the pack until the following spring. After a winter fraught with danger, where the yacht's voyage was threatened on multiple occasions, the Fox was finally freed. After stopping in Holsteinberg Bay for repairs, the yacht made a second attempt to cross Melville Bay. This time, luck was on their side, and they arrived at Beechy Island on August 11th. Here, McClintock placed a tombstone gifted by Lady Franklin for her husband and his companions near the monument to Bellot and the previous search expeditions. Unable to pass through Peel Sound, McClintock set his sights on Bellot Strait, a disputed and untraveled route. The existence of the strait was quickly verified, but it proved treacherous with violent currents and threatening ice masses. After several attempts, he resigned himself to spending the winter at Port Kennedy, an indentation on the north side of the strait. The winter passed without incident, and on February 17th, McClintock set out to gather information from the Boothian natives. To his disappointment, the coast seemed deserted until he stumbled upon 4 Eskimos. They were able to provide some information on the missing explorers, though it was not much. They reported that a group of white men had starved to death on an island near a river. They hadn't seen the men, but they and their friends had items that used to belong to the whites. To have the natives construct a snow hut for him, he paid them with needles, then sent them to tell their comrades that he would buy any relics they had at a fair price. The next day, the entire community arrived with spoons, forks, buttons, and knives, all of which McClintock purchased. He returned to Port Kennedy on March 14th, completing the discovery of the coast of continental America during his 25-day absence. Upon his return, Young was sent to Fury Beach to retrieve sugar and provisions left by Peary. He found the supplies in exceptional condition. By April they were ready for the sled journeys, with 3 parties led by McClintock, Hobson, and Young. Each party consisted of 4 men pulling one sled, 6 dogs pulling another, and an officer and a dog driver. McClintock had arranged the provisions and equipment so skillfully that he expected each party to be able to journey away from the ship for 70 or 80 days without difficulty. McClintock and Hobson embarked on their journeys on April 2nd. Initially, they traveled together and used their tents as sails to take advantage of a favorable wind. It wasn't until they had made significant progress down the coast of Boothia that they encountered natives who told them about 2 ships that had been sighted some years prior off King William Land. One of the ships had sunk in deep water, while the other had been forced ashore by the ice, and was believed to be still there, though damaged. The natives had obtained most of their wood from this ship. On April 28th, the explorers reached Cape Victoria on the southwest coast of Boothia Felix. They were to separate, with McClintock generously allowing Hobson to explore the more promising west coast of King William Land, while he took the less hopeful east coast. Hobson's orders were to cross to Cape Felix, the northernmost point of King William Land, and search the entire west coast for the missing ship, or any relics or records that might be there. If he didn't find anything, he was to cross to Victoria Land and complete the exploration of that coast. Meanwhile, McClintock intended to head south down the east coast of King William's Land toward the Great Fish River. As anticipated, McClintock thoroughly searched the east coast and Great Fish River estuary, but found nothing of significance besides occasional relics from the natives. On May 24th, he crossed the strait and joined up with Hobson to continue their exploration. On the next day, his patience was finally rewarded. While slowly walking on a gravel ridge near the beach, which the winds kept unusually bare of snow, he came across a skeleton partly exposed. From the clothing nearby, he gathered that the victim was likely a steward or officer's servant who had fallen on his face while walking on the bare ridgetop. An old woman that McClintock had spoken to on his journey had said that the unfortunate explorers had fallen down and died as they walked along. This discovery confirmed the melancholy truth of her words. At Cape Herschel, McClintock found the cairn erected by Simpson, which he demolished in the hope of finding some record left by the missing explorers, but he found nothing. He learned 12 miles further on that what he had been searching for had already been found. He came upon a second cairn of more recent construction, which marked the end of Hobson's brilliantly successful journey. Hobson had passed the point where the Erebus and Terror had been abandoned, and had found the journey's first and only important record. The record, enclosed in a tin box beside a tumbled cairn, was brief, but contained the entire history of the ill-fated expedition. It consisted of one of those printed government forms that were supplied to all discovery ships. The forms were intended to be filled out with intimations of discoveries, accidents, or distress, and then enclosed in a bottle and thrown into the sea or buried under a cairn. A note at the head, written in several different languages, requested the finder to forward the paper to the Secretary of the Admiralty, or, if more convenient, to hand it over to the nearest British consul, with an intimation concerning the time and place at which it had been found. One of Franklin's officers had written the final message from their expedition. The document contained the following information. Her Majesty's ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70 degrees 5 north, longitude 98 degrees 23 west, 28th of May, 1847. Having wintered in 1846 to 1847 at Beechy Island in latitude 74 degrees 43, 28 north, longitude 91 degrees 39, 5 west, after having ascended Wellington Channel to latitude 77 degrees and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well. Party, consisting of 2 officers and 6 men, left the ships on Monday, the 24th of May, 1847. The margin contained additional notes. April 25, 1848, Her Majesty's ships Erebus and Terror were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September, 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of FRM Crozier, landed here at latitude 69 degrees 37, 42 north, longitude 98 degrees 41 west. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by death in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed, FRM Crozier, Captain and Senior Officer. Signed, James Fitzjames, Captain Her Majesty's ship Erebus, and start tomorrow, the 26th, for Back's Fish River. Lieutenant Irving found the paper under the cairn that Sir James Ross erected in 1831, 4 miles to the north. The Latitude Commander Gore deposited it there in June 1847. Franklin had made an extraordinary voyage in the history of Arctic exploration. He had sailed through Lancaster Sound and Barrow Strait, up Wellington Channel, and returned to the mouth of the channel via the west coast of Cornwallis Island. He had wintered off Beechy Island in 1845-1846, and the date given in the paper was clearly incorrect. Upon his release, he aimed to journey south to the American coast, but was apprehended by the pack ice, never again to roam free. The winter of 1846-1847 was spent just 15 miles northwest of Cape Felix, the furthest point north on King William Island. By spring, when all aboard were considered to be in good health, 2 officers and 6 men embarked on an unspecified expedition. A fortnight later, Franklin was spared the misery of witnessing his men's slow, agonizing deaths by cold and starvation as they failed to reach home. The summer brought no relief, and during the following winter, the 2 vessels drifted southward with the ice for some 30 miles. As soon as the conditions allowed in the spring, all those who survived left the ships to attempt to make their way back to civilization, but not one of them succeeded. Such a woeful tale, McClintock laments, was never recounted so concisely. Their straightforwardness is deeply touching, demonstrating that both the leaders of the retreat were motivated by a profound sense of duty and faced the fearful alternative of a final, valiant struggle for survival rather than perishing without attempting escape aboard their ships. Before reaching the Fox, McClintock had the misfortune of discovering further evidence of the tragic fate of the unfortunate explorers. After rounding King William Island's westernmost point, Cape Crozier, whose desolation was indescribable, he happened upon a boat that had been part of the Franklin expedition, containing 2 skeletons. Hobson had previously found the boat and left behind a note for his superior stating that despite an exhaustive search, no journal or other notes were found to fill in the gaps of the already known terrible events. McClintock got right to work examining the boat and its surroundings, hoping to find something his junior officer missed. Sadly, he found nothing. The boat was light, suitable for the Great Fish River with sails, a sloping canvas roof, an ice grapple, and a deep-sea-sounding line. However, it was mounted on a heavy sled, making it difficult for even 7 healthy men to drag it over the ice. Inside the boat, McClintock found 2 skeletons, one huddled in the bow. There were 5 watches, 2 guns, and several books, mostly devotional. But despite searching, they found no pocketbook, journal, or clothing marked with a name. The boat was filled with pieces of sheet lead, tacks, and other miscellaneous items, which McClintock described as a mere accumulation of dead weight, of little use, and very likely to break down the strength of the sled crews. The only provisions were tea and chocolate, but not enough to sustain life in such a climate. No biscuits or meat were found. McClintock concluded that the party had set out for the Great Fish River, but turned back due to exhaustion. Unable to drag the boat any further, they left it behind, intending to bring back food for their weak companions. The fact that 5 watches were left in the boat suggested they didn't plan to abandon it for good. But overcome by cold and fatigue, they perished on the way. After leaving the boat, McClintock hurried on, searching for signs of the wrecked ship, but found none. He arrived at Point Victory on June 2nd and discovered a note from Hobson, who had also not found any trace of the ship, but had found a duplicate of the record. McClintock examined the cairn where the paper was found and discovered a variety of items, including scientific instruments, cook stoves, pickaxes, shovels, and clothing. However, none of the clothing had any markings to identify the owner. McClintock observed that these abandoned items were evidence that their countrymen had prepared themselves to fight for survival. McClintock then returned to the Fox, reaching Bellot Strait on June 18th. On the way back, he learned that Hobson had fallen seriously ill and had to be placed on one of the sleds. However, upon reaching the ship, McClintock learned that Hobson had recovered from his scurvy. After leaving McClintock at Cape Victoria, Hobson crossed James Ross Strait easily and headed westward around Cape Felix. He came upon the first signs of the Franklin expedition, a large cairn beside 3 small tents with blankets and old clothes. However, no record was discovered despite digging around the cairn. A small cairn was found 2 miles farther to the southwest, but no record or relics were found. A third cairn was examined 3 miles north of Point Victory, but only a broken pickaxe and empty canister were found. Along with the boat and record, these findings completed Hobson's discoveries. Meanwhile, Young had been exploring Peel, later called Franklin Strait and Prince of Wales Island, in the face of great difficulties. Gales were almost constant, and a channel between Prince of Wales Land and Victoria Land was discovered, which widened his field of discovery and lengthened his search. To have fewer mouths to feed, he sent most of his men and dogs back to the ship and continued with only George Hobday. For 40 days, they pushed forward until Young became so ill that he had to return to Port Kennedy. Despite protests from the doctor, he went on another journey 3 days later. In all, he explored 380 miles of new coastline, and combined with the 420 miles explored by McClintock and Hobson, the expedition had a total of 800 miles to be proud of. McClintock aimed to head home as soon as the thaw would allow. On August 6th, steam was prepared to be utilized once the opportunity presented itself, which occurred 3 days later. The death of his engineer resulted in McClintock being very understaffed, and he manned the engines for 24 straight hours. Despite occasional ice delays, the return journey went smoothly, and the Fox arrived in the English Channel on September 20th. It is worth noting that in 1875, Captain Young attempted to follow the path established by Franklin and reach Bering Strait via Peel and Franklin Straits. However, an impassable ice barrier in Peel Strait forced him to turn back. In 1878 through 1879, Lieutenant F. Schwatka of the United States Army and Mr. West H. Gilder undertook an impressive journey, fully exploring the path the Erebus and Terror's crew was believed to have taken to the Great Fish River. Despite finding numerous remnants of the expedition, they could not locate any papers or documents of any kind. Chapter 19. The Voyages of Dr. Elisha Kent Kane and Isaac Israel Hayes. America hadn't played a significant role in Arctic exploration until the mid-19th century. In 1853, Dr. Elisha Kent Kane led an expedition that made history by venturing into Smith Sound, a point never before reached by explorers. Kane had been given orders by the U.S. Navy Secretary to search for Sir John Franklin, but his mission didn't focus on areas where Franklin was likely to be found. The Advance, the ship used in Lieutenant de Haven's advance and rescue mission, was chosen for this expedition. Mr. Grinnell, Mr. Peabody, and American scientific institutions shared the expenses. The crew consisted of 17 officers and men, including Brooks and Morton, who had served under de Haven, and Isaac Israel Hayes, a young surgeon who would later conduct his own expedition. Unfortunately, significant errors were made in provisioning for the voyage. Kane explained that they brought 2,000 pounds of pemmican, Borden's meat biscuit, potatoes, pickled cabbage, and American dried fruits and vegetables. They also had the salt beef and pork of the Navy ration, hard biscuits, and flour. Kane hoped to obtain fresh provisions before reaching the upper coast of Greenland. This diet made it almost certain that scurvy would break out, and the crew suffered terribly from the disease. On May 30th, 1853, the Advance left port in New York for what would be her final voyage. After facing various challenges in Baffin Bay, by August 6th, she had reached Cape Alexander and Cape Isabella, the colossal cliffs that protect the entrance to Smith Sound. The next day, nearing Littleton Island, which lies within the mouth of the Sound, Kane was disheartened to see the ominous ice blink ahead. Despite this, and the fact that the northward wind was picking up, he decided to press on as best he could, only stopping to stash a boat and provisions on the island, a move for which he would later be thankful. The following day, he encountered the ice and began his attempt to make his way through. However, a fog forced him to retreat to a landlocked cove, which he named Refuge Harbor, where he had to stay for several days. On the 13th, he took advantage of a change in weather to try to push on, but he was constantly hindered by gales, which by the 20th had escalated into a hurricane that almost ended the entire expedition. By the 22nd, the storm had died down, and Kane was able to proceed. However, his progress was extremely slow, as he had to send men to the pack with a tracking rope to drag the ship along as best they could. The next day, he discovered that he had reached 78 degrees 41 minutes north, a point 13 minutes higher than Inglefield's and farther north than any explorer, except for Peary, had ever gone. He began to understand that his chances of proceeding further that year were slim. He did not like the idea of spending a winter in such a northerly latitude, as he was surrounded by ice, making his chances of escape next year uncertain. He called a meeting of his officers and crew to seek their opinion on the situation. It is unclear why he did so, as their opinions did not influence his decision. Only one member favored remaining, while the rest wanted to return south immediately. Nevertheless, Kane chose to stay and found winter quarters in Rensselaer Harbor. Winter was harsh, with temperatures ranging from 60 to 75 degrees below zero. Spring brought little relief, and Kane had to prepare for his sled journeys in trying conditions. Despite the difficulties, he sent 10 men led by Mr. Brooks to cache provisions 10 days' journey from the brig. The party almost perished on the ice, with 2 men dying of cold and exposure. Olson, Sontag, and Peterson saved the rest by seeking relief on the ship. In April, Kane set out on a sled journey along the east shore of Smith Sound, facing sickness and lack of provisions. Scurvy reappeared in May, and many fell victim to it. Kane himself was so severely affected that he had to be tied to the sled. The shortage of provisions was due to the bears, which had destroyed the caches. Despite these challenges, Kane's expedition established him as a leading Arctic explorer. Kane recounts that the pemmican was covered with heavy stones, which took 3 men to adjust. However, the bear's remarkable strength allowed him to move the heaviest rocks, and his pawing broke the iron casks holding our pemmican into chips. The alcohol cask, which I had gone out of my way to deposit, was completely destroyed. Despite these challenges, Kane managed to reach the Great Glacier of Humboldt, one of the largest seas of ice. By the first week of May, the group's condition was so dire that they couldn't continue. Kane was delirious, and his companions could barely walk. Through heroic perseverance, they made it back to the ship. After a few days of rest and recovery, the exploration continued. Dr. Hayes was the first to depart with a sled and a team of dogs to explore the north and east of Inglefield's Cape Sabine. The dogs gave him trouble since their harness was constantly breaking, and he had to use his sealskin breeches to fix it. Regardless, he continued his explorations until he reached Dobbin Bay before returning to the ship. Despite gaining valuable knowledge of the coastline on either side of Smith Sound, Kane was still unsure if they were in a channel leading to a polar sea or in a cul-de-sac. He believed the former based on his observations of the tides and ice drift. To settle any doubts, he decided to send out another party with dogs. Regrettably, scurvy is not a malady that one can easily shake off. As the time came to assemble parties, only 5 able-bodied men remained. Despite the obstacles, Kane did his utmost to make the most of the situation. He assigned Morton, McGarry, and a trio of men to carry provisions to the Great Glacier, where they would rendezvous with Hans Christian, the party's hunter, and his dogs. Morton and Hans would then cross the strait and journey along the distant coast as far as they could. The pair tackled their mission with tremendous zeal, ultimately reaching Cape Constitution. They returned to the ship with fantastic stories of open seas and waves crashing against the cliffs. Kane was overjoyed with this news, as it not only supported his theories, but also reinforced the popular fallacy that an ice-free sea lay in the direction of the pole. Unfortunately, Morton and Hans were mistaken. While there is no reason to believe that their accounts were mere flights of fancy composed for their commander's benefit, they did not see what they claimed to see. By the start of June 1854, Kane realized he was in a precarious situation. All of his men were ailing, and several were entirely incapacitated. Provisions and fuel were dwindling, and he saw no way to free his ship that year. It became clear that his only recourse was to journey to Beechey Island and request assistance from Sir Edward Belcher. Thus, he mended his whaleboat to the best of his ability, and accompanied by the 5 healthiest members of his crew, set out on his perilous voyage. However, he did not get far, as he found the mouth of Smith Sound obstructed by ice. He had no choice but to order a retreat to the ship, which he reached on August 6th. After a meticulous inventory of his provisions, he reluctantly concluded that he must reduce their fuel rations. In his journal, he recorded the decision. Reduced our wood allowance to 6 pounds per meal. This amounts to 1/3 of a pound of fuel per person, considering our 18 mouths. It permits us 2 cups of coffee per day and 1 serving of soup. In addition, we have cold pork, boiled in bulk, and consumed as needed. This arrangement is far from ideal, but I must preserve the coal for dire situations. The future appears bleak. I examined the ice again today. It is in a deplorable state. I must face another winter. While we have a chance, I must prepare for the worst. It is dreadful, yes, that is the word, to anticipate another year of illness and darkness without fresh food or fuel. If I had no comrades to consider and safeguard, I could bear it with more equanimity. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and their only hope was to embark on a perilous overland journey in search of aid from the Eskimos. On August 28th, Hayes, Peterson, and 7 sailors departed from the ship, leaving the remaining crew to fend for themselves. Without an alliance with a nearby Eskimo tribe, they would have faced certain death from cold and starvation. The natives agreed not to pilfer from the ship and to supply the men with fresh meat and dogs. In exchange, Kane promised to assist them on their hunts and provide them with needles, knives, and other coveted items. The return sled trip from the settlement to the ship was so grueling and lengthy that Kane only sanctioned it as a last resort. On December 7th, a few Eskimos arrived with 2 members of the exploring party. Kane learned from them that their mission had failed, and their comrades were 200 miles away in a settlement. Kane sent the Eskimo escort back with supplies to bring back the rest of his friends. The natives were back with Hayes and his party in just 5 days, all of whom were in a state of collapse. They would have perished if not for the kindness of the Etah Eskimos. The winter was miserable for the explorers. As food, medicine, and fuel ran out, the men grew worse. Kane decided to make his way to civilized regions as soon as spring came. The only happy person on board was the hunter, Hans Christian, who had fallen in love with a fair Eskimo damsel of Etah. The return journey began in May, and was successful. They reached Upernivik on August 3rd, and were taken back to the United States in a squadron. In the following year, Hayes, Kane's surgeon, set out on an expedition to verify Morton's story of the open polar sea. Sontag, the astronomer, froze to death on a sledding expedition. Hayes made a series of blunders on his journey up the coast of Grinnell Land, including unreliable observations and mistaking Kennedy Channel for a polar sea. The channel freezes latitude and opens early due to exceptional tides and is rarely entirely closed. Chapter 20. The Polaris, Charles Francis Hall. In the annals of Arctic exploration, few figures are as intriguing as Charles Francis Hall. A native of Cincinnati, he began his career as a blacksmith, but harbored a deep-seated desire to explore the polar regions. After a stint as editor of the Cincinnati Daily Penny Press, Hall set his sights on the Arctic. Despite never having set foot on a ship, he was determined to learn the ways of the Eskimos and uncover the fate of the lost Franklin expedition. Hall believed that the English explorers had gone about their search all wrong. Rather than relying on brute force and technology, he felt that success could only be achieved by living among the Eskimos and absorbing their knowledge. Indeed, he felt called to undertake this mission himself. With funding from Henry Grinnell and other interested parties, Hall set sail on the George Henry with a crew of 30 officers and men, including an interpreter. His plan was to spend 3 years among the natives in Boothia, gaining their trust and learning their ways. Although Hall did indeed live among the Eskimos and became an expert on their customs, he did little to advance the scientific understanding of the Arctic or solve the mystery of the Franklin expedition. He returned home in 1862 and spent some time writing up his experiences. In his second voyage, 2 years later, he boarded the Monticello barge and sailed towards Repulse Bay. His goal was to connect with the natives and gather any information they possessed about Franklin's ships and party. Sadly, the locals knew the importance of his mission and, not wanting to disappoint, fabricated stories to fill in the gaps in their knowledge. As expected, Hall eventually realized that the tales were mostly flights of fancy. Disheartened, he returned to America. However, Hall had developed a passion for Arctic exploration during his stay with the Eskimos. He decided to shift his focus towards the North Pole, since there seemed to be nothing left to learn about the Erebus and Terror. Hall was a man of boundless enterprise and found friends, including Mr. Robeson, Secretary of the American Navy Department, who helped him launch his new project. Congress granted him $50,000 to cover expenses, and he was provided with a 387-ton wooden river gunboat, the Polaris. He departed from New London on July 3, 1871. Sir A.H. Markham noted that the expedition was never destined for success. Hall lacked education and knowledge of nautical astronomy, making him an enthusiastic leader who depended on others to navigate his vessel and make his discoveries useful. However, Hall had a significant advantage. His 2 prior expeditions had acclimatized him, and he had a complete understanding of Eskimo life. Unfortunately, the men who accompanied him were poorly chosen, with Buddington, an old whaling captain with no interest in the expedition, and Tyson, the assistant navigator of the same mold. Chester was a skilled seaman and harpooner, enticed only by high pay. Dr. Bessels, a Heidelberg-educated veteran of German Arctic expeditions and the Prussian army, was the sole scientist aboard the ship, and the only person, aside from Hall, who possessed any passion for the expedition's goals. The group was an ill-suited assemblage, lacking a sense of discovery, discipline, and control, with each member believing themselves equal to the next. Ironically, this poorly equipped expedition proved luckier than any of its predecessors. After picking up Hans Christian, along with his wife and large family at Upernivik, the Polaris sailed through the open polar sea, Kennedy Channel, Hall Basin, and Robeson Channel, ultimately reaching 82 degrees north latitude on August 30th, surpassing all previous records by 250 miles. It seemed as though they could have gone even further, had Hall possessed practical seafaring skills, as the ice blocking their path was minimal. However, Buddington was against the attempt, and Hall was obliged to comply, leading the Polaris to drift southward until it reached Thank God Bay on September 3rd, where it settled for the winter. 2 months later, the company was cast into gloom by the tragic death of Hall. He returned, rather chilled, from a sled journey, and unwise enough to descend at once to the cabin and drink hot coffee. His experience of life in the polar regions ought to have taught him that it was extremely dangerous to do this without first divesting himself of his furs and allowing his system to be toned up to the high temperature of his cabin. Within a few hours, he became seriously ill, and 2 weeks later, he died. Dr. Bessels's opinion was that his death was due to apoplexy. The command was now left to Buddington, who showed himself unfit for his duties. In the first place, he abolished the Sunday services, a step which was inadvisable and which in this case was absolutely criminal, as the men were quite ill-disciplined enough as it was. He developed a taste for sending out exploring parties and calling them back to the ship again for no comprehensible reason, so that no discoveries of any value were made, in spite of the exceptionally favorable situation in which the expedition was then placed. It was, however, after the Polaris had been set free, and while she was on her way home, that he gave the most convincing proof of his incompetence. The ship was caught in the ice when she drifted into Baffin Bay. On October 15th, she was stuck and at mercy of the savage winds, whereupon the panic-stricken Buddington promptly cried out, "Throw everything upon the ice!" Of course, the whole ship was instantly cast into confusion. The sailors hurled everything that they could lay hands on to the floe, including a bundle that was subsequently found to contain 2 of Hans Christian's children. Men, women, and children leaped after them, and though Tyson did his best to calm them, his efforts were not of much avail. While everything was still in confusion and while half the crew was on the ice and the rest on board, the ship suddenly freed herself and flew off before the wind at the rate of 10 or 11 knots an hour.